Welcome to Seeking Tranquility. This is John, and I'll be reading my essay, A Musician's Perspective on Language Learning. Becoming a musician requires attentiveness and other skills that transpose well to language learning. When I first began to work with computing technology, I needed a database to manage a combination of bibliographical and encoded musical information. I became acquainted with two consultants at my employer's computing center, one of whom was a musician. It was in this context that I first heard the assertion that musicians make good programmers, and indeed I came to understand over the years that this was something of a stereotype, at least in the years before around 2000. Being a musician myself, I was intrigued by the concept, and in fact became somewhat immersed in development of the technical infrastructure that my project required. At a certain point, I began to articulate an explanation of why musicians take naturally to computer programming. Musicians, by practicing, are accustomed to working alone, relentlessly performing repetitive tasks, seeking to create coherence and meaning across nonverbal, micro and macro structures, striving for perfection. In other words, we acquire technical mastery by breaking things down musically into their smallest logical components, repeating and refining these until they become fluent, then joining them with what precedes or follows to shape meaningful phrases, ultimately to build tension, expectation, resolution, and a sense of overall meaning. One of the values I see to musical training is that one learns through practicing techniques and skills, an approach that transposes well to learning and understanding things in both quantitative and verbal arts, such as mathematics and language. It also simply develops the ability to sustain attention for long periods of time. Language learning seems to me to have a particular kinship with music, insofar as it requires listening to build understanding, as well as to enable the ability to create or to recreate sounds. It requires sensitivity to the nuances of the temporal flow of sound, rhythm, and meter, to shape comprehensible phrases and sentences. And it strives for the ability to detect and mimic the melodic shape of spoken language, the rise and fall of pitch in spoken language that lends it intellectual or emotional expression. Indeed, I've always been fascinated with language acquisition and actively transpose approaches from musical learning and practice to language learning. How does this work? In effect, I have adopted an approach to learning languages, currently focusing on improving my fluency in French, that looks very much like how a musician approaches mastery of their instrument or of a piece of music. A key part of this is a daily practice routine. I spend a part of almost every day in language study, sometimes no more than 10 minutes if circumstances demand, but often an hour or more. While I might begin a musical practice session with exercises to limber up the muscles used while playing, scales, arpeggios, other etudes, I often start my language learning simply by reading aloud from the French newspapers I subscribe to. There might be new vocabulary or a turn of phrase I have to linger on to fully discern its meaning, and these can interrupt the flow. If I am not understanding something's meaning, I cannot read aloud in a meaningful way either. So I'll pause, acquire understanding, then repeat so that the spoken language feels natural. I might also then make notes about vocabulary or word usage for future study. Frequently these days the newspaper offers audio versions of its articles, sometimes read by its author. There will be times when I listen to these as well, and on other days I will also record myself reading these same pieces aloud, then listen and compare. I have a basic recording setup I use to create voiceovers for my Substack essays, and I use this for that too. Again, this feels much like the experience of learning to perform a piece of music, recording it, then reviewing the recording. You always hear things differently during playback, and frequently things just don't sound the way you thought. Sometimes it is quite painful, sometimes rewarding. I think of this as my cobbled-together language lab experience. Some language teachers frown on the old tradition of studying vocabulary lists, but it's still part of my practice routine. Over the course of time, my list consists less of individual words than of idioms, expressions, and common phrases, which I find more challenging to master. It's in this context that I find that the old music practice techniques kick in. Let's say, for example, I'm trying to master an idiom like être au ras des pâquerettes, which means literally to be at the level of daisies, that is, to be at a low intellectual level. I'd first take être au ras de, which might be used itself in some other context, then join it up with des pâquerettes to build the idiom. Then someday I'll be able to reel it off spontaneously to everyone's astonishment. Il reste toujours au ras des pâquerettes. Or let's take a phrase like en être encore à ses balbutiements, to still be in its beginning stages or infancy. I'd break it down into en être encore and à ses balbutiements, then put it together, finally building, as spontaneously as possible, new sentences that use the expression, such as mes efforts pour apprendre le français en sont encore à leur balbutiement. So does it work? I'll only say that when I was in my 20s and learning German, things took hold in memory much more easily, and it helped to have a year in Germany to drive it home. When I was learning Swedish in my 30s, in the US, the language lab was a godsend, and the closest thing available to hearing Swedish spoken naturally by Swedish people. It was an enormous help to be able to listen to native speakers and to hear myself trying to imitate them. Now, decades later, living in France, things seep into the consciousness and deep memory more reluctantly, but in the course of time I see steady progress. There is one other big difference. The muscles of the speech organs are more reluctant these days, set in their ways from years of primarily speaking English. I benefit from having learned some French at a young age, but I could probably pronounce French better at age 4 than I do now. My humble opinion: learn to play music and speak another language at an early age. You're likely to develop learning and listening skills that will last long into the future, in language acquisition, but in many other contexts as well. Thanks for listening.